My name is Bill Smith. I'm a senior fellow at the Pioneer Institute, and I'm director of their life sciences initiative at Pioneer. We're going to talk today about a very interesting topic, and that is gene therapy, which is some of the cutting edge science that's coming out of the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries, as well as academic research. Let me first introduce my two panelist colleagues. First, Dr. Ann Sydor is founder of VT4, which is a research design consultancy and a grant writing agency. And she's also the director of research development and communications at the Global Healthy Living Foundation, which is a patient advocacy group that seeks to improve the quality of life for people living with chronic disease. Ann has a PhD in neurobiology from Harvard University and is the lead author on our gene therapy paper. Our other panelist is Dr. Robert Popovian, who's a pharmacist and economist and is affiliated with both Pioneer Institute and the Global Healthy Living Foundation. Robert was a longtime colleague of mine at Pfizer, and it's a pleasure for me to work with him again at Pioneer. Um, we we started the Life Sciences Initiative at Pioneer because we thought there needed to be some public education about the life sciences ecosystem. It's an area of policy that has very unique characteristics. Life sciences are R&D intensive, and public, private, academic entities do intensive research, and it's very high risk research. The statistic I read the other day is that only 6% of drug candidates that make it into clinical trials are ultimately approved by the FDA as a medicine that you can give to patients. However, as complex as the life sciences environment is generally, the area of gene therapy is even more complex. As Winston Churchill said, some things are a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And gene therapy is one of those things. It's very hard to understand the business model of it and the science around it. So we wrote this paper as an educational exercise to do that. And what we hope to do today is demystify the world of gene therapy. We have all read the headlines about the $1 million gene therapies and why do these drugs carry 6 and 7 figure price tags? How are they different from traditional medicines? We're going to talk about that today. I'm going to turn it over to my panelists. Anne is going to start, and she's going to introduce us to the topic. What are we talking about? What is gene therapy? Anne, it's all yours.
Thanks for the introduction, Bill. I also want to thank Pioneer Institute for the opportunity to work on this paper and my delightful colleagues, Robert Popovian and Bill Smith, who are co-authors. This is a really complex topic, and it's been a pleasure working with all of you on it to try to shed some light on some of the complexities. The FDA defines gene therapy as the use of any genetic material, and that could be DNA or RNA, to treat human diseases. That's actually a pretty broad definition. It includes CAR T cell therapy, it includes RNA therapies used to control what genes are expressed. It also includes gene replacement therapy, which is what we've discussed in our paper and what we'll be discussing in our webinar today. Gene replacement therapy, or GRT, is a really unique type of therapy, and it turns the whole model of how we pay for medications on its head in some ways. To understand that, we first have to understand what GRT is. With GRT, a person who has a variation in a specific gene, which has been in the past called a mutation. They have a variation in that gene or a mutation that makes the gene dysfunctional or disease causing. And with GRT, we give them a functional copy of the gene that's causing the disease so that the disease is no longer there. The functional gene DNA is carried into a person's cell with a piece of viral DNA, and that viral DNA is no longer pathogenic or no longer causes disease in and of itself. It's just a snippet of the viral DNA that can be used to carry the replacement gene into a person's cells. Each gene replaced with a GRT is unique. The vector that's used as a carrier is also unique to each gene. And that vector is designed to maximize functional production of the replaced gene. So to create a gene therapy, we first have to identify a gene, figure out how to make a functional copy of it. Then we have to identify a vector that can carry it and figure out how to make that vector as functional as possible in terms of making sure the gene gets expressed and the function that it encodes is actually produced. Um, I think I'll stop there. That's probably complex enough.
Thank you, Ann. That is complex, but I think you did a great job explaining it. And I'm going to turn it over to Robert. There's been controversies about the market, and he's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the controversies bill has to do with dollar amounts, right? The headlines are always sensational. I mean, we just heard Len Meldy, which got approved for $4.5 million, and it's the headline on the CNN and Bloomberg was is the most priciest medicine ever. But then when you start digging into this information, you realize quickly that number one, what is the impact of this gene therapy that was just approved? What is it that it's doing? And the data is very supportive of what it's trying to accomplish, which is saving lives. And I'll give you one idea. Like, so this is for primarily for either infants or for juveniles. And there's a huge mortality rate, if whether it's an infant or a juvenile, upon like 4 or 5 years of treatment. So in the study that got the approval for Linmaldi, actually 100% of the patients, infants who were administered this, are alive at 6 years. The average, actually, the follow-up was about 12 years, but the average was 6 years that they looked at. So they far bypassed whatever the historical data, because historically, about 58% would have only survived. So 42% reduction in mortality. But the bigger issue is, what are we talking about with regards to number of patients? A lot of these gene therapies, let's focus on. In the United States, there are only 40 children that are born with this mutation that can be treated with the Lameldi. So what does it accomplish? It's about $180 million. And that's the thing that the policymakers oftentimes overlook. They look at the sensational number of 4.5 million, but they don't realize how many patients are being treated with it and what is the impact of that treatment. And that's where we try to write in the paper that as individual policymakers, decision makers, what you need to do is not only look at the price, but look at what is the impact in longevity, in reduction of costs of healthcare, because a lot of these patients would have required other types of therapies or other types of care, including indirect and direct costs, and then look at number of people who are being impacted. We're talking about very few patients who are going to be really benefited. And I know in the past, when I left Pfizer, there was a lot of hoopla in the marketplace by the insurers and the pharmacy benefit management companies who made a big deal about how this tsunami of gene and cell therapies that are going to be coming through in the approval process. And the reality is that that has not happened. Well, it hasn't happened. It's bad for patients that it hasn't happened, but it really hasn't happened because it demonstrates the complexity of doing research in this space. And it's really difficult to be able to bring products into the market. And that tsunami has like gone away. And what you see is that since the inception of gene and cell therapies, I'm going to combine the two. I know this is a gene therapy paper specifically, but combining the two, there's only like 18 drugs that are available in the market. And I think there's 8 or 9 that are gene therapy. And they have only 25 indications. And if you look at it, it's about 2 or 3 approvals per year. So there is no tsunami. There's nothing coming out. And I remember when I was writing my initial paper on gene therapy in 2017, the promise was that Pfizer at that point, which I was with, was going to have at least 2 gene therapies by year 2020. And that's not been the case. And the reason is, again, the complexity of the research that's going on. So price is important, but that's not the whole story. It's what it does, what do these medicines do, or these gene therapies do? How many patients are they impacting? What are they saving with regards to lives and costs, indirect and direct? And most importantly, that look, this is for a limited number of drugs that are coming out. And because of the complexity of research, we're going to see these drugs like trickling in instead of like coming in at a very high level.
Thanks, Robert. Let's go back to Anne. And Anne, Robert pointed out that gene therapy. You pointed out what high-end science this is, and Robert pointed out that typically the universe of patients to be treated by gene therapies is smaller than, say, a blood pressure pill. Talk about some of the unique characteristics that make gene therapies different from the run-of-the-mill medicines you get in the pharmacy.
Sure. So, first of all, GRT is the epitome of precision medicine. Only people who are known to have a dysfunctional variation in the gene that can be replaced get treated with a specific GRT. As we've shown in our paper, and I think Caitlin's going to put up a slide here, for the 6 gene replacement therapies that were approved at the time we finished the paper, the annual incidence of disease varies from 75 people to 500 people who are affected each year. So, over a 7-year period, the typical on patent period for any medication, you're talking about 1,500, 1,600 to 35,000 people being affected. So that's really how precise these medications are, and I think that's a hugely important thing to keep in mind. Continued development will mean more gene therapies for more dysfunctional genes. And it may eventually mean we can use gene replacement therapy to address some multi-gene diseases. So there's huge potential here. I don't want anybody to think that just because only a few people are affected now, we shouldn't be investing in those gene therapies. First of all, the lives that are being changed, saved, transformed are as worthwhile as any other life. Second of all, there's potential to impact much, much larger numbers of people. That really requires continued investment, though. Benefits of GRT so far are revolutionary. We've returned sight to blind people. We've preserved the lives of people who would otherwise die in childhood. Not just with the cell therapy Lameldi that Robert mentioned, but also with Zolgensma, which treats spinal muscular atrophy, a disease that without treatment typically results in death before age 2. Also remarkably reducing the burden of symptomatic treatment. So people with hemophilia don't need blood infusions a couple times a week, but maybe a few times a year. And really reducing disability. So these benefits are huge. The other big difference of GRT, and I think this is hard for people to get their heads around. This is not a medication like a blood pressure pill. Once you're diagnosed and you get that prescription, you're going to take that pill every day, day after day, month after month for the rest of your life. Gene therapy is completely different from that. You're going to get that treatment once. And the price tag that's in those 6 to 7 figures is for a lifetime of treatment. Not a day of treatment, not 30 days of treatment, not 90 days of treatment, but it's typically a lifetime of treatment. So that's a really different way of thinking about medications, and it changes how we think about paying for them as well. And I think those are really the key differences between GRTs and the medicines we've been used to talking about.
And Bill, let me add to what Anne raised, because the continuous investment is super important. And what we found out in our paper, and we talk about it, is that how investment and financing has become so difficult in this space in the last few years. And partially has to do with the higher interest rates. You know, as you and I have talked about multiple times, investment or money is fluid, right? So as investors, venture capital people that are looking at this space, they're looking at when the interest rates are extremely high, like they are now, are they going to get a better return on their investment just by parking their money in a CD account, which is super safe, and they're going to get a very healthy return of 6-7% while not investing. And what we've seen in the last few years with the interest rates of being high, the level of being able to raise the money has gone down significantly in the biotech space because it is such a risky investment. But also we've with that, it has correlated with a lot of the biotech companies going into bankruptcy. We had the highest number of bankruptcies in 2023 of these small companies. And that's what concerns us, because at the end of the day, if the investment's not there, and because of the high risk nature of this thing, and because of other factors like interest rates being so high, are we going to be able to continue investing in this space? Like Anne said, the need for future research to be able to look at this.
Yeah, Robert, let's go back to this issue of price, which is the most controversial one around. Obviously, there's a smaller patient universe, and the smaller number of customers you're going to have. If you do expensive R&D, the prices are just going to be higher. Talk a little bit about that, and also talk about the challenges of R&D that in this space, which are uniquely challenging, and how that's related to price.
Yeah, I mean, they're unique. Let's start with the uniqueness of these gene therapies, because first of all, as Anne mentioned, most of the time these are single therapies that are provided to the patient. Now, a lot of these studies have a long tail of following up these patients to make sure that the efficacy is retained over a period of time. So first of all, instead of doing and my background is infectious diseases, I used to do antibiotic trials. You would follow the patient for the duration of the therapy with the antibiotic, maybe 30 days post-therapy, to just make sure there were no side effects. You were done in day 40 with a typical pneumonia study, for example. Well, as I mentioned, this last drug that just got approved, the average time of follow-up so far has been 6 years, and this is going to continue for the foreseeable future. So that adds to the cost of doing the research, number one. Number two, because there's so few patients and there's so few entities that do this type of research, the cost per patient to do the research is extremely high. We've seen that in the oncology space already, right? When I was doing clinical trials, again, in the antibiotic space and the anti-infective space, we may have paid maybe about $2,000-$3,000 per patient for recruitment of that patient per site. I can tell you, oncology trials now get upwards of about $150,000, $200,000, $300,000 per patient, because there's so fewer of them, and it's a much more complex way of doing research than it is in the past. And there's more requirements on investigators. So that adds to the cost. So the length of doing it, per patient cost of doing the research are adding to the cost. And then, so when people talk about it and they say, well, this was a 40-person study that you did, or a 50-person study, you have to take into context of all these other things that are happening from an R&D perspective around it. So the cost of R&D hasn't really dropped. What has happened is that you're just forcing it in fewer patients to be able to do it in a longer period of time. So, and you're recouping, to be able to recoup this investment, you have fewer patients that you can sell it to. So it's a numerator denominator issue that we faced now with certain other drugs, like cancer drugs that are very precision type of medicines that only treat a few hundred patients or thousands of patients. Now you extrapolate that to a gene therapy, maybe for 40 patients or 50 patients, which is going to be much higher per patient. So the R&D cost hasn't dropped really significantly. It's much more complex type of studies that to do it, and the requirements are going to be that you're going to have to follow these patients until mortality, which, because they're extending life, this is an unknown at this time from an investment standpoint. So again, we're not. There's a reason why these things are costing so much, and there's multiple issues that are going on in the same time.
Yeah, I recall anecdotally talking to someone from a gene therapy. I think it was a company. I can't remember whether it was academic or a company. And they said they were doing a gene therapy clinical trial, and they were trying to recruit patients, and they found a patient in rural Idaho.
Yeah.
A female patient in rural Idaho. They had to set up an entire clinical trial site for one patient. They had to send up a nurse, a statistician, a whole bunch of people to support this one patient. And that gets very expensive. So anyway, and let's talk about another expense of gene therapy, and that is manufacturing. I've been to Pfizer's manufacturing sites when I was there, and I know it's complex. You have to mix the chemicals properly at the right ratio, and then there's a pill stamper, and but ultimately it's not a very expensive process. I mean, some of the Pfizer guys were really proud that they had gotten the price of manufacturing a Lipitor pill under 5 cents.
Mhm.
And that's great for them. But talk about gene therapy and what goes into manufacturing a gene therapy.
So it's actually another reason why these therapies are so expensive. Not only are the clinical trials that expensive, as Robert spoke about, and the initial R&D is much, much more expensive, but the cost of producing each treatment is much more expensive. You're never going to get to 5 cents per gene therapy treatment the way you get to 5 cents per a pill for high blood pressure. These therapies, we show in our paper that the manufacturing process is 3 times as complex at minimum compared to small molecules. With a small molecule, we bring our truckloads of chemicals in, we put them into a vat, a gigantic vat, much, much bigger than my house, even potentially, in these huge factories. And they get mixed at the right temperature and under the right conditions. A chemical reaction happens, and then you purify and powderize and put the pill stamper on and turn it into pills. It's about 6 steps, and it's all happening at scale. With gene therapy, these are biological molecules that are produced by cells that are grown in sterile jars. They're big jars, but the size is limited because the cells have to have enough room to reproduce so that you're producing large enough quantities of the biologic material that you want to harvest. I also mentioned about the two-part nature of gene therapies. You have to do this for the vector, you have to do this for the gene that's being replaced, and then you have to do it for the combined gene and vector as well. So again, much, much more complexity, much smaller facilities that are more expensive to produce, and the knowledge and training required to take care of those cells being grown in jars, to purify the proteins that come out of those cells, to get to a product that's safe to use. It requires a much more highly trained technological workforce that can produce things in a sterile environment. So that's another level of complexity. A challenge with this is that currently the FDA requires that every manufacturing process, every step for all 3 components is finalized before they can even start a clinical trial. So you have to build your manufacturing plant and your process and train your workforce and get all of that done before you can even start to test a compound. And that requires enormous upfront capital for anyone to invest in GRTs. So thinking about how manufacturing is complex, and maybe the same regulations that we use for small molecule manufacturing, maybe those aren't the best standards to be using for gene therapy manufacturing, considering just how different the process is.
Yeah, and Bill, what Anne said, and you have to think about gene therapy and biologics pro- as being a process oriented, right? Process orientation rather than the small molecule stuff is more about the actual molecule and the active ingredient, right? So that when the process is so complex, it adds cost. So yes, the individual, maybe the gene itself is not maybe that expensive, but to get to a point that it is a viable treatment, it is super expensive to go through these processes. And that's why biologics are so difficult to make, because it's the process than the actual ingredient. And frankly, the other thing, and talked about, FDA is not doing anybody any favors. They have these rigid standards regarding processing, going through the process and getting the drug approvals. And it really, this current regulatory environment discourages improvements in the processes that can improve the yield of these gene therapies and reduce costs and everything else, because what they assume is that if you're using a different process, it's a different molecule, so you have to start over again from the regulatory process of approval and everything else. And everybody knows that you improve the process as you go on forward, and we've documented in the paper that there are ways for the FDA to change its regulatory process to really help not only improve the yield, but also reduce the cost.
Well, we're stating the obvious that gene therapies are more expensive than typical therapies. And this is a bit of a question out of left field, Robert. But when we first started the Life Sciences Initiative,
Right.
we invited up Mark McClellan to come talk about creative reimbursement strategies. In other words, if you have $1 million therapy and you spread out the payments, as long as the drug is effective, the health plan can keep paying. Is there opportunities to be creative about reimbursement when it comes to these therapies, or are we not discovering anything that's a light bulb idea?
So it's not, I mean, it's an academic exercise right now, right? We've done a ton of work. I know Mark has done a ton of work at Duke Margolis on this issue. The MIT folks have, Mark Tushheim has done a ton of work in MIT looking at different payment models. And on the surface, and I have to be careful because I fall into the trap too, because on the surface, you think about it and you say, of course, there needs to be a different payment model because these things, you give it to them, it's a lifetime of therapy. And, in our current model, especially under 65, these patients move around from one insurer to another, or one employer to another. Therefore, is it fair, for example, for United Healthcare to pay for this, but not gain the benefits down the line, right? So it sounds great. And I don't disagree with that. And I fall into it too sometimes, and I have to pull myself back. And yesterday I was like preparing my notes for this. I was looking at some data. You know, there's a lot of things we pay for in this country through our commercial insurance model that really the initial payer, the insurer, like let's say United Healthcare or CVS Health, is not going to benefit down the line of that intervention. So the simplest ones to look at, we always talk about hip and knee replacements, right? There is about 790,000 knee replacements and 544,000 hip replacements. And the assumption is, well, those are Medicare patients, they're old patients, 65 and older. That's not the case actually anymore. The average age for knee replacement and hip replacement has been dropping over time, and the average now is about 65 years of age. So if you think about it, it's a normal distribution. Half of those patients are going to be under 65. They're going to be in commercial. So commercial payers have no problems paying for a hip replacement, which they know fully well that patient may not be with them. And just to give you an idea, we spend about $54 billion between hip and knee replacement in the United States. So this is not a small proposition that the insurers are taking on. Another one is transplant. I've always felt like transplant, it's younger patients more and more. We have an average, and I just looked at yesterday, just a kidney transplant. Average kidney transplant costs about $500,000. Well, we did about 25,000 kidney transplants in the United States. It's enormous amount of money that we pay for a one-time intervention that the patient's going to benefit for a very long time. But we have no problems doing that. And you made the comment to me, and I completely agree with you. It's always easier to complain about drugs rather than all these other medical interventions that we do, and we don't anticipate that the same insurer is going to benefit from it on the commercial side, because not all the transplants are Medicare patients again. Average age is probably around 50 or 55. So, in other words, there's been a lot of academic exercise that's been done. Nothing's been proven that anybody can really do it. But before we get into this and like this environment that we have to completely upend our model that we're doing, let's step back and see where else are we investing as a society where the benefits come down the line for many, many years, and maybe the initial payer is not benefiting from that. And we do a lot of those things, and somehow or another, gene and cell therapies have taken hold that we have to change the model because of these kind of therapies. But I'm really skeptical that we do, because our commercial insurance model pays for stuff that goes long term. So
Yeah, and I'm going to turn to you, and I know you are affiliated with a patient advocacy organization, and um, some of the gene therapy results are of biblical miracle status. I mean, they're incredible. So tell us just a few patient stories. Pick any of the gene therapies you're knowledgeable about, and tell what the patient would go through, what the parents would go through. Let's tug at the heartstrings a little bit with this one, because it is an area of medical science that tugs at the heartstrings.
Sure, and I want to connect that to what Robert, we've talked about so far is cost and and how to pay for all of this. What we haven't really touched on yet is value. The value of these treatments is that they are life-saving and life-transforming. It's actually a little hard to understate the value of the treatments, but it's also hard to say exactly what it is because we don't have enough years of experience with these treatments to know for sure. And we've in all the work that Robert and I have done together, we've never wanted to err on the side of hyperbole. But this is certainly an area where you can become hyperbolic. um, the example that tugs at my heartstrings the most was one of the first approved gene therapies, which is for spinal muscular atrophy. Children born with this condition, um, they learn to roll over, they might learn to crawl, they sit up, um, and then shortly afterwards, they start to lose those abilities. Their muscles become floppy, their motor skills start to degenerate, they can't sit by themselves. Eventually, the muscles that support breathing deteriorate, and usually about 90% of people, of children with the condition, they're on a respirator before age 2, and they're not with us anymore after age 2. And kids treated with gene therapies for spinal muscular atrophy have now, I think the oldest patient treated has lived to age 21, um, which is really phenomenal and amazing. And who knows what that person is going to contribute to our society. So how do you really value that? We can also bring the value back to the numbers, though. And as I was listening to Robert talk about the different things we invest in, I remembered an example from our paper, which is treatment for a rare type of non-small cell lung cancer. Incidence of the disease is about 10,000 a year, and the treatments are priced at 240,000 a year for an impact of $2.5 billion for just 1 year of treatment for all the people who develop it in a year. So we're willing to pay $2.5 billion for those 10,000 people who get that type of cancer so that they survive, on average, another 12 years. That's pretty great. Another 12 years of life is great. You may or may not think that $2.5 million for 10,000 people to live 12 more years is, you make that value judgment for yourself. But if you think about it, 2.5 million, you can also think about it in terms of what the cost per person is. So 240,000 per year for 12 years really quickly adds up to well over $2 million, which is the price tag for gene therapy for SMA. So I just don't think we're ever comparing apples to apples here. And I think that's what we need to do when we talk about new pricing models.
And that's why, Bill, I'm like really, look, I have utmost respect for both Mark and both Marks and what work they've done in this space, but I'm really skeptical that we need to upend the payment model because because of these therapies. As I said, I fell into the trap and thinking that we should and we have to, but now more and more I'm looking at this stuff, I'm going, not necessarily. We do it as a society, we invest on things that we will never get the benefit. Let's go back to even small molecules. We invest on, insurers pay for cholesterol drugs, they pay for smoking cessation. That insurer may not benefit from that patient quitting smoking, but they still pay for it, you know? So this whole idea that, insurer is not going to benefit, therefore they should not be on the hook, I think it's a false narrative and
Yeah,
anything else.
I remember when Harvard Pilgrim was considering covering Zolgensma when it came out. Maybe it was a different drug. I think it was Zolgensma, and they went through their files and they discovered they had one patient,
Yeah.
one patient. I just don't see how one patient is going to bankrupt a multi-billion-dollar health plan. But uh, we'll move on.
Or
Robert, I want to.
I would ask if why one patient with non-small cell lung cancer who needs treatment to the tune of $2.8 million over 12 years, why is that person not going to bankrupt the insurance company, but somebody with spinal muscular atrophy, a child with spinal muscular atrophy is? So, again, it's a false narrative because we're not looking at how long are we paying for this? How many people are we paying it for? What's the total impact to the economy, as well as the total impact to a company's bottom line? I think it's a case of sticker shock.
Yeah, I think
Because
so
you hear
too.
this high price tag and you get the sticker shock, and nobody's thinking about how long, how many, total impact. When you do that, I don't think the pricing model, the payment model needs to change at all.
I agree. I think it's a false thing. The other thing is, Bill, and you are probably better versed on this than what bothers me is people like ICER who are sticking their thoughts into this, and they're starting to put qualities under it and everything else, and they're making value judgments that they have no place because, as you've documented, you know, quality research, quality type of assessment really negatively affects patients with rare diseases or older people, you know. And again, they're trying to get involved, and it's interesting, most of their assessments find these drugs to be extremely cost effective, so it's not in an ironic way they're supporting, you know.
Yeah, let me give my 2 minute ICER anti-ICER commercial. I mean, ICER I see as an entirely subjective, at least the quality as an entirely subjective cost effectiveness methodology. And the reason it's subjective is because they set a threshold of the value of a human life. They say a value of a human life might be $150,000. It's different in every country that uses equality. But let's just say they set it at $150,000. The the threshold that you choose to value a human life will determine the cost effectiveness of every therapy that you evaluate. So, for example, if you say a human life is worth $10, no drug is going to be rated as cost effective. If you say a human life is worth $100 million, every drug is going to be rated cost effectiveness. And you can move that threshold of the value of human life up and down depending on how many drugs you want to exclude from your formulary. And that's what these countries do. It's a completely arbitrary, subjective. They can tweak the threshold of the value of human life and determine what their budget is going to be next year for drugs. I consider it. I'm very cynical about it. I think it's a completely subjective and arbitrary. And when it comes to gene therapies, I wouldn't trust it at all. I wouldn't trust their cost effectiveness analysis as far as I could throw it. That's just my personal opinion. But let me get off my soapbox and let me turn to Robert. Let me say at this point that if people in the audience have Q&A, please put it in the chat and I'll try to get to it. And while Robert answers this last question, but Robert, our gene therapy paper, Anne's gene therapy paper, or the three of us' gene therapy paper, it was different than your typical Pioneer Institute paper, which has specific policy recommendations in it. You know, tax rate should be at this rate. Parents should be provided with an education voucher so they can have school choice at this level. Very specific policy recommendations. What we did in this paper was different than that. We tried to set the narrative and help people understand what the gene therapy milieu was like. And to inform, obviously, we want to inform policymakers so that they make reasonable decisions. But talk about some of the recommended considerations. We didn't say policy recommendations. We said recommended considerations that policymakers should think about when they're trying to decide how to treat these therapies.
No, yeah, we couldn't, there are no policy recommendations because we didn't really fully buy into these new payment models that need to be instituted, because after we did our own research, we found out that one, nobody was doing it. B, it was just a ruse by the insurers and PBMs just to garner more rebates. You know, that's what it boils down to right now. So no, our recommendation was more like, as a policymaker, as an individual who's evaluating these therapies, looking at these therapies, or trying to see if they're right or wrong. Don't get the sticker shock, like you said. Don't look at the price of the medicine and just hold say, oh my God, it's $4.5 million. Number one, that. Then when you the price comparison to traditional pharmaceuticals, it's an unfair comparison. It's completely different way of developing, manufacturing, regulatory process that these things go. The investment is super risky. It's far more risky. I mean, if small molecules 6% get approved, this one is
Yeah.
probably even much lower. And Bill and I are, you and I are working on another paper that we've seen in some therapeutic areas. It's dropped to like 1% or even less than
Less
1%.
than 1% in pain. Yeah.
Yeah, in pain. Then the other thing is patient. Patient lives change. This is people, you talk about muscular dystrophy, but it's people with blindness, they can see again. This is life-changing therapies. This is not just marginal, managing your cholesterol and things like that. That may benefit you or may not benefit you from having a heart attack. And then that the research and development is extremely complex that we talked about. It's very risky and uh, investment is fluid, and right now the environment is anti-investment, and the reason being is because of a variety of reasons that are regarding the complexity and the risk of doing the research, but also because of the way interest rates are. And frankly, as an economist, I don't blame people with venture capital, because if you have capital, you want to invest, you want to get the safest return on investment, and right now you park it in a CD account, you can get 6-7% in return. Why
Yeah.
would you put it in towards a biotech company?
Yeah, I heard a professor from Harvard Medical School lecturing the other day about it. He was anti-drug company, of course, and he pointed out that the average price of a drug had risen from, I don't remember the exact number, but from $200 a year to $100,000 a year, or some statistic like that. And he did not provide any context. He did not say, well, wait a minute, we're producing more and more therapies for smaller and smaller populations. Of course, the average drug price is going to rise. And I just, there's so many people in this space who just give out lies, damn lies, and statistics that don't capture what's going on. And that's what we tried to do in this paper, is
Yeah.
to provide the context and people understand this is a very complex area. This is very complex science. It's for a small patient population, and it's amazing research. It's amazing, life-changing research. So with that lecture, I'm going to let Anne have the last word. I don't see any questions in the chat, so we might end early.
So I think some of the other recommendations I want to touch on, because they have to do with the things that make it such a risky investment. The upfront capital costs. So a different way of regulating standardized manufacturing by the FDA would substantially change things. If you held people to ISO standards or other standards, rather than making them have each and every new manufacturing process approved, that actually would encourage innovation and quality improvement in the manufacturing process. And we might see some cost decrease. That might not happen for a long time, because these therapies are all really new and we don't have these manufacturing plants built and all of these things, but we're certainly holding back that development with those regulations. The standards we use in clinical trials, where the FDA right now really prefers to see a clinical effect, a lot of these diseases are slowly progressing, and you're not going to see a clinical effect for years, especially if it's mortality, as Robert was talking about. So thinking about proxies for evidence of benefit, and using the accelerated pathway, which is something that even Peter Marks has endorsed for these kinds of therapies. Those are things that would actually encourage investment, because it could bring that 6% success rate, or if it's in GRTs, if it's 1%, it could actually increase that rate. And for me, I'm always about what's going to benefit patients. I want science to be to the benefit of patients. And the way to do that is to make it. Right now, we create drugs by having people invest and make money off of that investment. We've got to find ways to make it more attractive to invest in gene therapy, while still making sure that gene therapy remains safe for patients.
On that lovely note, thank you, Ann. Thank you, Robert. Thanks to the audience. We're going to end a little early. We're out of questions and we don't have any more. So thank you all for tuning in. And this will be recorded, I believe, and will be posted on the Pioneer website eventually. Thank you.
Thank you.